So let's begin. And the zchut of our learning should help to bring home the hostages and protect our soldiers and Am Yisrael, all of the innocents, and bring an end to all of our conflicts.
Amen.
So what we saw last time, we finished learning the sugya about Tinokot, and just as an introduction to what we're going to look at tonight, I said we'll look at how this comes down in halacha, how did later poskim deal with this sugya. So as an introductory remark, I'm going to point out something that I didn't mention all the time that we were learning the sugya, which is that actually there are a number of girsaot in this sugya. Oh, here's Paul. So hold on, just let him connect. And here's Paul. Okay. Hi, good evening. How are you?
Okay.
Okay. So I told Michael I had prepared more sheets for us to continue to talk about how the sugya that we learned, how it's understood by later poskim, and what's like what's halacha l'maaseh. And unfortunately, I can't get these sheets to work. I did them in LibreOffice, and the last day or so, LibreOffice keeps crashing on me, and I'm not sure why. I've restarted LibreOffice, I've restarted the computer, and I think I know what I have to do, but I just don't have time to do it now. So unfortunately, we'll learn the things that I wanted to learn, but we're going to learn them using mostly the Bar Ilan version, which isn't broken up as nicely as the way I do it, but we'll muddle through. Because I liked this last week when I had everybody read, so I'm gonna also have you try to read tonight, but it'll be a little more challenging because I don't have the lines broken up, but we'll figure it out. So what I just said to Michael is that when we start to look at later poskim who dealt with this sugya, what we discover is that there were a number of girsaot in this sugya, and some of them are, they're very different. Some of them are very different, and in a way, they deal with some of the questions that we glossed over. We mentioned along the way when we're looking at, for example, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, that they talk even apparently even when Rav Huna is talking about tinoket, but he keeps referring. He uses lashon zachar, right? He keeps saying ben tesh ben eser and so forth. The other there are other girsaot though that seem to resolve this. We're not going to go through all of them, but because both because of time limitations and as it starts to get very confusing, I thought I'll start off by looking at the Rabbeinu Hananel, and we can kind of extract from his Perush what his girsa was. But let's just remind ourselves what we learned until now. So we learned that there's a machloket between the way we learned. Yes.
You mean girsaot of the Gemara or of the Mishnah, like they have in Achigar Sinan, the different.
Yes. Yes.
And
yes.
you mean that that the different commentators, they had different versions of the text, and therefore they
Exactly.
understood it differently. That's what you mean.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. In fact, actually, I think we'll ease into this a little bit differently than I was just about to do. I think the way we'll ease into it is first, let's look at the Rambam. And the Rambam, in the order of the things that I was going to show you, is a bit later. But let's read the Rambam and see. What we saw based on the Girsa that we have, and the Girsa that we have it was Rashi's Girsa. Rashi did not say Hachikar Sinan, where he says in many occasions when he is either promoting a particular version or he's amending and making what he thinks is the proper version. But um, it's clear that the version that we have in our Gemara is the version that Rashi had. And we'll see that there are other versions. So what we're going to do is we'll start actually from the Rambam and we'll work back and then we'll go forward. So I was going to do it in chronological order, but I think this way maybe it might be easier to start to get a mindset that starts this way. So here, we're in Rambam Hilchot Shvitat Asor, Perek Bet, Halacha Yud. Michael, why don't you read?
קטן בן 9 שנים ובן 10 שנים, מחנכין אותו לשעות, כיצד היה רגיל לאכול בשתי שעות ביום, מאכילין אותו בשלוש, היה רגיל בשלוש, מאכילין אותו בארבע, לפי כוח הבן מוסיפין לענותו בשעות, בן 11 שנה בן זכר בן נקבה, בטענה ומשלים, בדברי סופרים כדי לחנכו במצוות.
Right, so Ben Zachar, Ben Nekeva. So, first of all, let's just see. So the Rambam says what? That a katan, a child who's 9 or 10, v'chanchin oto l'sha'ot, and he explains what that means, right? Ketzad haya regil lechol b'shtei sha'ot, so if he's accustomed to eating 2 hours a day, feed him at three hours a day. If he's accustomed to eating at 3 hours a day, you feed him at 4 hours a day. And according to the strength of the child, you add on how much you make him fast on those for those hours. By the way, Michael Werner isn't here tonight, but I wanted to tell him that he was correct that in English, fast is also a transitive verb, which means that you can't say the fikocha ben mosifin lanoto, that according to the strength of the child, we fast him more, which sounds funny, but it is technically correct. In any event, what does the Rambam end off by saying? Ben achadesrei shana, ben zachar, ben nekeva, mitane umashlim midivrei sofrim, kedei lechancho b'mitzvot. So a child who's 11 years old, whether it's a male child or a female child, they fast and they complete the fast midivrei sofrim, which would be midirabanan, in order to educate them about the mitzvot. So, what do we see in halacha in the Rambam that we did not see in the Gemara? You can remember from last week.
Yes, first it doesn't do a difference between a boy and a girl. It's what we saw, there is a 1 year difference between the girls and the boys.
Right. So what did we see? We had the Ma'amar of Rav Huna, who, according to our Girsa, is talking about a tinoket, and according to him, beginning at age 8, if she's strong at age 9, if she's not strong, then Mechanchin Ota L'Sha'ot, and then when she's 10 and 11, she's Mashlima, again, apparently, depending on her strength, she's Mashlima Midrabanan. And then we had Rav Nachman, who was talking about a boy, and he said he starts at 9 and 10 for Sha'ot, and then 11, 12 for Mashlimi Midrabanan. And then we had Rabbi Yochanan, who said that we start 2 years prior to Samuch, right before their age of majority, l'sha'ot, and there is no hashlama midurabanan. Now we have the Rambam, who says, first of all, he talks about a katan, apparently a boy, right? He doesn't say specifically, but he says katan ben teisha. So we're going to assume that it's a boy, right? That when he's 9 and when he's 10, then mechanchin ota l'sha'ot, and then when he's 11, ben 11 shana, ben zachar, ben nekeva, mitaneh mashlim. So the question would be, so who's the Rambam paskening by? Because we don't have any de'ah in our Gemara that goes like this Rambam.
He seems to have a new shita, which is his shita, which is not even. It's not even an interpolation between the other ones. It's a new one.
No, but what we're going to see is the Rambam wasn't basing himself on the Girsah that we have in the Gemara. So we're going to go
he had
back.
another text.
He had a different text. But
okay.
let for the moment though, we'll just read the Ravad, right? So Hasagat HaRavad. So Paul, can you read this? Ben 11?
השגת הרעב"ד בין 11 שנה, בין זכר ובין נקבה, מתענה ומשלים מדברי סופרים.
Okay, so that's the quote from the Rambam. And then Aleph Aleph is Amar Avraham. That's the Ravad. Avraham said. Go ahead.
Is Abraham.
Right, Avraham ben David. His name is Rabbi Avraham ben David. That's the Ravad.
אוקיי, בסדר. אמר אברהם, גרסה זו לא מצאנו אותה בספרנו שיהיו הזכר והנקבה שווים, אלא הכל לפי הבריאות, הזכר לפי זמנו והנקבה לפי זמנה. והלכה כרב הונא ורב נחמן. יומא בפ"ב דקיימי בחדה שיטה ולא פליגי, זאת אומרת, תצא ארמית. עדידי אלא מר מיירי בתינוק ומר מיירי בתינוקת.
Okay, so I'll explain the last part, but the first part you understand. So he says, we didn't see in other words, the Raavad understands that the Rambam had a different girsa. But he says, we didn't see this girsa in any of our Sfarim. So essentially, from the get-go, he rejects the Rambam because he doesn't think that he says, I don't know this girsa. I'm going to rely on
where did the Ravad live?
In I'm not going to say it properly, but he was the Ravad of Posquières. Posquières.
Which is in North France, yes? Northern France. So it may be that the Sfaradim or the Jews which were in Arab countries had different texts from those.
They did. They did. They did, and we'll see already, because I was going to start with the Rabbeinu Hananel and the Rif, but I thought, okay, we'll start here and we'll go back. Usually, when you see a difference like this between the Rambam, in other words, here with this Rambam, even without the Ravad, we understand that the Rambam must have had a different girsa in the Gemara. Usually the Rambam was using the girsa of the Rif, and the Rif was using the girsa mostly of the Rabbeinu Hananel. And we have now the Rabbeinu Hananel, of course we have the Rif. And so we're going to go back and look at them.
You have the Gersa?
Well,
Okay,
we'll see. We will see that because we'll see in a moment. Just to say, we'll see in a moment. But let's
is it a
just
reconstruction through the commentators, or really somebody found the text? It's
Techef nira. I'll explain in a moment. I'll explain in a moment. Okay, but so the Ravad essentially, so he disagrees because he has a different girsa. So he disagrees with the halacha of the Rambam, and he says we don't have a girsa that says that the zachar and the nekeva have the same din, but rather it's according to the health of the zachar, according to his time, in other words, and the girl according to her time, because there was an assumption that they boys and girls mature at different times, and then he paskins, right? So we ask the question.
But they do both talk about the strength of the child. So there are children who are stronger, not as strong.
Right. So that everybody agrees that prior to the age when you're chayav deoraita, that the strength of the child is going to be a factor. So he also acknowledges that. Everybody acknowledges that. That wasn't mifurash in the Mishnah, right? But it was implied in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says lifnei shana lifnei shtayim. And so, what does he paskin? He says we hold like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. And what was this last part? The kaime b'chada shita, shehem kayamim b'shita achat. So to mean הם מסכימים. They have the same shita. ולא פליגי אחדדי. הם לא חולקים אחד על השני. אלא mar mairi betinok. Mar, one of them, right? Adon midaber betinok. Adon midaber betinoket. Right? And that's the way we learned it. And that's the way, that was the way Rashi learned it. And so now, if we look back for a moment at our Gemara, I keep checking to see if no. I keep checking to see if my other sheets are going to work, but they're still frozen. One of the things that was interesting, the way our girsa was, right? We had Amar Rav Huna, right? So we had Rav Huna who he introduces this language of Zachar, Ben Shmona, Ben Tesha, Mechanchin Oto L'Sha'ot, but then who Mesayem B'Mila Betinoket. That all of this is, so there is a possibility that this word Betinoket was added on later on, that it wasn't part of the original Girsa, but it was just a note so that you understand that that's what Rav Huna means. And Rav Nachman, right, he ends off with the word betinok. And there also, maybe it was just there so to support this idea that Rashi promotes. Rashi says explicitly that there's no machloket between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. But one is talking about a boy, one is talking about a girl. That's the way, and then we see that's the way the Raavad understands. Now we'll jump back and we'll look at the Rabbeinu Chananim. Okay, Michael, you're up again. Tinokot.
התינוקות אין מענין אותם ביום הכיפור, אבל מחנכין אותן קודם שנה, קודם שתיים, בשביל שהיו רגילים במצוות. או קימנה,
Okay, so stop for a second. So just so we understand, so the Rabbeinu Hananel is a Mefaresh, right? So he's going to explain the Gemara. And so he starts off, what he did here, he just quotes the Mishnah. So this was his girsa in the Mishnah. And now he's going to speak.
או קימנה,
Go ahead.
בבריה קודם
So
שתיים,
Babri,
בבריא קודם שתיים, קודם שנה בחולה, דייקה מתנתנה, our Mishnah, כרב הונא,
Matnitin. Yeah.
מתניתים, כרב הונא ורב נחמן דאמרי בבן חטא, בבן ט' מחנכים אותם לשעות. בן י' א' משלימים מדרבנן. ובן י"ב משלימים מדרייתא בתינוקות, ותינוק בן ט' ובן י' מחנכים אותם לשעות. בן י"א, בן י"ב משלימים אותם מדרבנן.
Okay, so we'll stop here. So Okimna, right? Anachnu Mekaimim, in other words, we'll establish that the Mishnah is talking about Bibari Kodem Shtayim and Kodem Shanaz Bicholeh, right? So that's what Rav Chisda said in our Gemara. So he says that's the way we're going to learn the Mishnah. And Deka Matnitin Kirav Huna V'Rav Nachman. Our Mishnah, it can be read particularly or precisely like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, that they say. So he also agrees with Rashi. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman don't disagree with one another, and they both agree on the following: that they say mi ben chet mi ben tet, right? Mi ben shmona ben tesha mechanchin otan l'shaot, right? The child is 8 or 9, we do chinuch l'shaot, and 10 and 11 they have to finish midurabanan, and then ben yud bet mashlimi miduraita betinokot. So this is essentially the same way we see in our Gemara. And then he says of a tinok, ben teisha ben eser mechanchin l'shaot, ben l'chadesrei ben shteimesrei, mashlimin otan midurabanan. Okay, let's continue. Paul, beha
איפה זה? דדתני
ditani
דתני רבא בר שמואל מחנכין אותן שנה או שנתיים סמוך לפרקן משני חינוך זה
It's really
השלמה
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
חינוך זה השלמה מדרבנן היא
Stop. We'll stop there. Stop.
ודקתיהו
רק שנייה. חכה רגע. So let's just understand. So remember, we got up to a certain point in the sugya, and just to give a quick recap, so we had this machloket. We had Rav Nachman and Rav Huna on the one hand, and we had Rabbi Yochanan on the other hand. Then we asked a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan from our Mishnah, because we said our Mishnah goes well like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. And for Rabbi Yochanan, it's a problem. And then we answer for Rabbi Yochanan. And then we had Rabba Bar Shmuel. He brought another Braita, which went well for Rabbi Yochanan, but was a problem for Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. So what's the Ben Yochanan saying? He says, "V'hadatani Rabba Bar Shmuel." That Braita that was learned by Rabba Bar Shmuel that said, "V'chanchinotan shana u'shnatayim samuch lefirkan." That was the end of the Braita that he brought, and that went like Rabbi Yochanan. So he says, so in other words, that would be that was the one that was a kasha on Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Mishane, in other words, which means like mishivim, like we answer it by saying, chinuch ze hashlama midrabanan. When in Rabba Bar Shmuel's Braita of Mechanchinotan Shana Shnatay Samuch Lefirkan, chinuch there means hashlama. In other words, the reason this Braita seemed to go like Rabbi Yochanan is because until that point in the Gemara, we understood that Mechanchin meant Mechanchin L'Sha'ot. And even Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, they also used Mechanchin to be Mechanchin L'Sha'ot. And they used the word Mashlimin to mean that they have to finish. But they didn't use this language of Chinuch. So now we have this Braita that says Mechanchin Shana o Shnatayim Samuch Lefirkan. That is the chinuch, which we understand to be chinuch l'sha'ot. That's for 1 or 2 years prior to them becoming mature. So that only leaves room for this shita of Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said that's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan said. That for a year or 2 before, mechanchinot l'sha'ot. So it doesn't fit at all with Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, right? So Rabbeinu Hananel says, Mishane, so the Gemara answers Rav Huna and Rav Nachman by saying, Chinuch zeh, in other words, when the Braita said, Mechanchinon tan shana o shnatayim, this chinuch, hashlama mid'Rabbanan. That's how Rav Nachman and Rav Huna are going to learn that this chinuch is that the Braita is talking about. It doesn't disagree with them. It's just talking about hashlama, and it's calling chinuch. It's calling hashlama chinuch. And I'll just read the next couple of words because they're going to be harder for you. Udechevatayu kayamalan dibatrai inon. Dikavatayu kamohem, like them, kayamalan ze mikuyam lanu. In other words, we hold like them. Dibatrai inon. Kihema meucharim, hema achronim. They're the later ones. So remember, we ended last week. I asked you who you thought halacha was going to be like. So there were different possibilities, and one possibility was maybe you hold like Rav Huna. I don't know if we mentioned this possibility, but this is one of the possibilities. We had Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. They're the generation after Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbeinu Hananel is saying, we're going to paskin like them because they're batrai, because they're later.
Is there a principle that the later psika is the one which is accepted?
Yeah, there is a principle, and this is what Rabbeinu Hananel is holding by. There's a principle that when we talk about Amoraim, B'tkufat Amoraim, that we go after the later opinion. And the svara for that, what's the svara? Why would we, what's the
Why are
reasoning
they
to
better
say?
than the masters?
So, so what's the reason we would hold like by the later ones?
Mhm.
Is it because we think they're better, or what else could we say? You don't know?
That because it's like they have more time to decide, in a sense.
Well, I'll put it this way. The understanding would be these later Amoraim saw what the previous generation or generations said, and nonetheless they paskin the way they paskin. In other words, the assumption is they took into account the previous generation when they made their decision. Just like
That's
um,
not what's happening today. Where the Haredim, they say, no, we have to accept the psika of the Agdolim. You can't change anything. That's
yeah,
just the
well,
other way around.
um,
Although
you,
they do change, but
you,
they say they
you,
don't, but they do.
yeah, you're touching on a very complex issue, and also I don't want to generalize because yesh v'yesh. Um, זה לא חד וחלק that they say, but they do say that we have to go after the Gdolim, but this is a topic for another occasion. I actually got into this in the shiur I give on Thursday night. There's a discussion. The Ramah actually has a short comment on this in Choshen Mishpat about how we paskin, and then one of the Nosei Kelim in the Shulchan Aruch there is the Shach, the Siftei Kohen, and he has like a very long essay that goes into this. And so I will say a little bit about it now because it's pertinent. From the Gemara we have certain klalim. Like actually, there's a klal in the Gemara that we don't paskin straight from the Mishnah. Gemara that says you don't paskin straight from the Mishnah. There was a recognition that we don't always hold halachas like the Mishnah, and then we have other klalim, like we say, and these are klalim from the Gemara that we say safek dioraita the chumra, v'safek dirabanan the kula, right? Um, and we also have certain klalim which we have touched on in this shiur at various times about dinim derabanan, and if there's a takana or a gzera of one beit din, another beit din can't come along and change it unless they're gadol uh, b'chokhmah u'b'minyan. Right? There's certain tanaim, there's certain conditions that will allow a takana, the rabbanan, to be changed, but only very particular conditions. So some of these klalim were would say, more pertinent at a time when there was a Sanhedrin, and so the Sanhedrin had the authority to make takanot and gzerot, and so there would be an idea that a later Sanhedrin can't change what the first Sanhedrin said unless they met certain criteria. But now, at some point, of course, we didn't have a Sanhedrin anymore. And so then we have the Kufat Amoraim. And like I say, the Gemara already starts to build up certain klalim, and this is one of them. One of them is that halacha is kebatrai. And it's based on this idea that I said that the batrai, that the later ones saw what the earlier ones said, and they paskined the way they paskined. So they had the benefit of knowing what the previous generation thought, and then they had their own diyunim. But then after the time of the Gemara, so then of course some of these um, klalim sometimes they contradict, and one of them is uh, we mentioned, I think maybe Michael, you were the one who mentioned that, for example, usually halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan was considered in his time to be the Gadol Hador, and we have
Michael
klalim.
Werner said that.
Oh, Michael Werner said that. Very good. One of the Michaels. Rabbi Yochanan was the contemporary of Rav and Shmuel. They were all Talmidim of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but Rav and Shmuel went back to live in Bavel, and Rabbi Yochanan remained in Eretz Yisrael. And when there's a machloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Shmuel, or Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who was in Eretz Yisrael, halacha is almost always like Rabbi Yochanan. So we might think that maybe we should hold like Rabbi Yochanan. And so the Rabbeinu Hanano is going to address that. So before we get back to it, but I'll just finish off what I'm saying. In terms of later times, let's say post Gemara, then we go through different kufot. So we have the kufa of the Sabaraim and the Gaonim, and they're among the people who start to establish. Those are the generations where people are paskening based on their understanding of the Gemara, based on some of the klalim that were already established in the Gemara. And then, I'm going to skip several hundred years. If you come to nowadays, it's not the rules for paskening are not clearly defined, but there are certain things that are muskam, right? There's certain things that are generally agreed upon. And among the things that will be agreed upon is that certain rabbanim, certain poskim in history always have to be taken into account when you're paskening. So, for example, the Rambam came to be widely accepted as one of the most important poskim of all time. And so if a later posek doesn't agree with the Rambam, as a general rule, he still has to address the Rambam. And in our day and age, let's say, we still have to look at the Shulchan Aruch, and Ashkenazim have to also look at the Ramah, right? Because the Shulchan Aruch with the Ramah became widely accepted. It's not that Yarad Bat Kol Min HaShamayim, but we see that as a practical matter, the Shulchan Aruch became very widely accepted. And that's why we have a lot of commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. A lot of those commentaries don't agree with the Shulchan Aruch, but they chose to write their commentaries around the Shulchan Aruch as a recognition that this is now like the basis for the way we're going to paskin. And if I disagree with the Shulchan Aruch, okay, but I have to acknowledge the Shulchan Aruch. And then from the time of the Shulchan Aruch until now, we have literally thousands and thousands of tshuvot, as well as, I don't know, probably hundreds of sifrei halacha. And so how do you sift through all of them to make a psak? So I'm just gonna leave it and say different poskim have different attitudes toward that. Some rely very heavily on going through achronim, and I think that maybe an outstanding example of that is Rav Ovadia Yosef, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of Shas and Rishonim and Achronim, and he just had a phenomenal command of this literature, and he had a very systematic way of putting them together to lay out the different arguments for any given psak. And just as an example of a contrast to the way of Rav Ovadia Paskin, I think it's fair to say that Rav Moshe Feinstein, who also had a tremendous command of halachic literature, that when he paskins, he often tends to go back to Gemara and Rishonim and work through them himself. And it's not that he ignores Achronim; he'll reference Achronim, but he feels more beholden to earlier sources and the way he understands those earlier sources. So, there are different approaches to these things. Ad hayom hazeh, there are different approaches, and we don't have, as you know, we don't have the Sanhedrin. There was an attempt to revive the Sanhedrin about 20 years ago. I don't know if you're aware of this.
I remember something.
What's that?
I remember something about it. It's in the back of my mind.
Yeah, there was a revived Sanhedrin that had 70 or 71 Rabbanim. One of them actually was Rav Steinsaltz. He was one of the people in this Sanhedrin. The way I heard about it, this was, like I said, this goes back just about 20 years ago. I was asked, they had like a what would you call it? It was like a statement of like a statement of what, how they how they established themselves and what their purpose was, that was written in this sort of flowery rabbinic Hebrew, and I was asked to translate it to English. So it could be that it's buried somewhere in one of my old hard drives, this statement. But as you know, it never really took off. It's not the first time in history since the destruction. The Sanhedrin survived the Churban Beit HaMikdash for, I'm not sure exactly how long, but at least for a few generations, there was still a Sanhedrin. And then it kind of petered out. There was an attempt to revive it in the time of Yosef Karo. Yosef Karo's Yosef Karo was a Talmud of the Maharibe Rav, and he sought to reestablish the Sanhedrin in his time. So this would be like 16th century. And so Yosef Karo was one of the people, and there were a number of other contemporary rabbis who were, saw themselves. And but also, as you see, it didn't take off. In other words, we talk about it as an historic anomaly, not because it really had an impact. And the same thing with this and the other time that it came up in recent history is at the Hakamat Medina, at the time of when Israel was established. It was trying to remember his first name. His name was Maimon. Rav Maimon tried to reestablish a Sanhedrin. He thought that now that we have sovereignty again in Eretz Yisrael, we should have a Sanhedrin. But also, it didn't. It never caught on. It didn't take off. So we don't have a Sanhedrin. I have my own opinions about that, about why we don't. But okay, but for whatever reason, we don't have it. But here, to come back to so that's just a little bit of a discussion. But here, let's come back to Rabbeinu Hananel. So Rabbeinu Hananel is, a late Gaon, right? He's in the late Gaonic period. He's in the 10th century in North Africa. And he's paskening this sugya. And so he says, "U'tekavatayu kayamalan." we hold like them. In other words, like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, the Batrai Inon, because they're Batrai. So let's continue on because he's going to still feel that he needs to explain himself further. So Michael, you can read. Va'af al gav.
The Afagav, the Rebbe Yochanan,
Samach lamed means
severe,
svira
severe law,
sevira lay.
severe lay, the Hashlama, the Rabbanan Lecha, Ela Shana
Leka.
Leka, Ele Shinab Lechola, B'Shtaim Lebria, B'Chachinin Otam L'Shaot, Uvirkan Mishlamim Midoraita.
Okay, so what does this mean?
Uh,
Af al gav der Rabbi Yochanan svira lay da hashlama midrabanan leka. What does leka mean?
Oh, that there isn't. He doesn't hold that there's a rabbinic fast.
Right. So even though Rabbi Yochanan, in other words, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold like the way we just learned this Breita of Rabbi Bar Shmuel. He doesn't hold that there's Hashlama Midurabanan. Ela, rather, Shana l'chole u'shtayim l'bari, v'chanchin otan l'sha'ot. A year for a sick and 2 years for a healthy. We educate them according to hours. In other words, a year meaning what? A year for a cholah meaning what?
A year before, a year before their firkan, before their age of maturity.
Right. So a year if they're sickly, 2 years if they're healthy. Then we do chinuch l'sha'ot. Uvapirkan mashlimin midioraita. When they reach their age of maturity, they have to finish midioraita. So he's saying, we hold like Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, even though Rabbi Yochanan holds different. And he goes on to say, Paul, you can read. V'akshinan alei.
V'akshinan alei.
Alei.
Mamtanitin. Mimatnitin. V'sheni. לא,
V'shani.
ושני, ליה,
Lei.
כיוון, דהנה, מחמרי, ועינון בבת חי, ק"י, למה את מצא?
Kayamalan.
קיים?
Kayama. Im Aleph Besov. Kayamalan.
קיימלן,
Tivatayu.
כבתיהו.
So, Akshinan alei. So we ask, in other words, the Gemara asks the Kasha on him, on Rabbi Yochanan, from our Mishnah, Vishani lei, and they answer for him. Kevan dahani mechamrei ve'inon batrai kayaman kivatayu. Since these ones, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, are machmirim, and they're batrai, kayamalan kivatayu. Right? Mekuyam lanu kumoem, right? Kumotam. We hold like them. See, here he gives 2 reasons. Both because they're machmir and they're batrai. And he finishes off by saying, Michael, you can read Utre.
Utre chinuki havu the Tanya ezehu chinuk היה רגיל לאוכל בבית שעות, מאכלין אותם בשלוש. בשלוש מאכילין אותם בארבע, בהשלמה נמי בדרבנן חינוך קרי ליה.
Okay, so this is from the Gemara. There are two chinuchim. This was to answer for Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, this Tani de Rabbi Bar Shmuel, that there's two chinuchim, because we learn in another brayta what is chinuch, that if he was accustomed to eating at 2 hours, we feed him at 3 hours. At 3 hours, we eat him at 4 hours. Vashlama nami demid Rabbanan chinuch karile. And Hashlama is also called chinuch. So I'm not going to be more medayek in this Rabbeinu Hananel, I think, than we have to. I think there's a bit of a shibush. I'm not sure that this is precise the way it is, but in any event, we understand what Rabbeinu Hananel wants to say. He does learn our Gemara more or less the way we have it, and he's also left at the end of the sugya to figure out if I paskin like Rabbi Yochanan or like Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. He says we're going to hold like Rav Nachman and Rav Huna because they're machmir and they're batrai. So how are they machmir over Rabbi Yochanan?
It seems maybe because they start fasting earlier, even though it's not a complete fast, you start the child earlier.
So that's one chumrah. And what's the other chumrah?
And even though they haven't reached age, they still have to complete the fast.
Yeah, so they're altogether more machmir than Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan just says, beginning 2 years or 1 year before their pirkan, we make them fast the sha'ot. And according to now the way we're going to paskin Rav Huna Nachman, we're going to start 4 years before with sha'ot and 2 years before with hashlama. Okay, so bekitzur, that's Rabbeinu Hanani. Let's look at the Rif. Okay, so the Rif, now, Paul, you asked, when we were talking about the Rambam, you asked how we know the Girsa of the Rabbeinu Hananel or the Girsa of the Rif. So in the case of Rabbeinu Hananel, you see a lot of his commentary is directly quoting the Gemara, right? So we understand from his Perush what his Girsa is. With the Rif, it's even more meforash because the Rif wasn't a mefaresh, he was a codifier, right? He made a code, and his code, his Sefer Halachot, is almost purely just quotations from the Gemara. And that's what we're going to see now. So first, we'll start with his Girsa on the Mishnah. Paul, you can read Hatinokot.
התינוקות אין מענין אותם ביום הכיפורים, אבל מחנכים אותם קודם לשנה וקודם לשתיים, בשביל שיהיו רגילים במצוות.
Okay, so almost exactly the Girsa of our Gemara. In our Girsa we have Kodem Lishnatayim, but basically the same.
It speaks about רגילים ולא חינוך.
No, he says it
מחנכים. Okay.
Right. So the Mishnah all the Girsot of the Mishnah have this term chinuch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's see his Gemara. Okay, continue reading. Hashta.
So he quotes now the Gemara.
So now he's going to quote the parts of the Gemara that he deems to be relevant for making a psak.
Okay.
So go ahead.
השתא לפני שתיים מחנכים להו לפני שנה מבעיה.
All right. So that's a quest. That was the question of the Gemara. Hashta. What does hashta mean?
You explained it.
Hashata hacha l'shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
כן, השנה הזאת.
So that means Hashana Azot. So I said Hashta, the term means achshav, means now. So literally
Okay.
means now before we,
זה בטח בא
right,
משעה.
right. Shata in Aramaic is the same as Shana in Hebrew. Oh, and by the way, Paul, because
שעה.
uh,
שנה או
uh,
שעה? שעה.
Shana, it's really Shana. Shata is Shana. But I found I mentioned last week that there's an essay on Dikduk Lashon in the Mishnah that's printed in the beginning of the Vilna edition of Mishnayot. And if you're interested, I looked up. I found there's a digital version that's available online, and he talks about the language of the Mishnah and how the language of the Mishnah was very much affected by Aramaic. And he gives a lot of examples, including how certain words came into Hebrew that we take for granted as Hebrew words. They came to us through Aramaic. They started in Aramaic. And also how it affected spelling. So like we have words like I don't remember the examples that he brings, but I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like sota. So sota, when you in the Torah, spelled sin, right? Sin vav tet hey, and in Aramaic it was with a samach, and nowadays in modern Hebrew we spell it with a samach. That's as yesh kol minei, but it's an interesting. It's not that long. If you want, I'll send you the link. I can send it to everybody, not just to you. I'll try to remember. I'll stick it in the email that goes out with the recording. In any event, he's just quoting the Gemara here. This was the question the Gemara. What did that mean, Michael?
That now that the Gemara or the Mishnah mentions 2 years, why is it necessary to mention only one? Because that should be included in the 2 years.
Should be including the 2 years. So, Paul, continue reading a little bit. Amar
Rav Hasda.
Pista.
חיסדא. לא קשי. כאן בחולה וכאן בבריא. כן, ראינו את זה בגמרא.
Exactly. So you see, he's just quoting the Gemara. So Chisda says, "Lo kasha." There isn't a contradiction here. There is no difficulty. Kan bechole, kan bebari. That here.
This is the same gersa you used last week, weeks ago.
It's the same girsa that we have in our Gemara, right? What I showed you on the screen.
In the Vilna Gemara.
Yeah, what I'm showing, when I make my sheets, what I'm doing is I'm just copying and pasting from Bar Ilan, from their version, and their version is the version of the Vilna Shas. So I'm just copying and pasting that, unless I otherwise noted. Okay, so the beginning here, the Rif is just establishing what the Gemara established, which is Kodem L'Shana Kodem L'Shtayim means a year earlier for a sickly person and 2 years earlier for a healthy person, for a healthy child. Okay, so Michael, Amar Rav Huna.
Amar Rav Huna ben Shmona v'ben Tesha mechankin oto l'shot ben Eser ben Echad Esra mashlimim b'derabanan ben Shtaim Esra mashlimim midaraita. V'Rav Nachman Amar ben Tesha ben Eser mechankin. Oh, sorry. V'Rav Nachman Amar ben Tesha v'ben Eser mechankin otan l'shot ben Echad Eser mashlimim midarabanan ben Shtaim Esra mashlimim midaraita. V'Rav Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, ben Eser ben Echad Esra machakim oto l'shaot ben Shtaim Esra mashlamim midaraita b'tinokot v'ben Shlosh Esra mashlamim midaraita b'tinok.
Okay, so we see. Okay, so this is the Rif's girsa. So in the Rif's girsa, he has Rav Huna. What does Rav Huna say? Ben Shmona ben Tesha mechanchina toloshaot ben Eser ben Echad Esrei mashlimin midirabanan ben Shtem Esrei mashlimin midioraita, and he doesn't add in the word tinoket. Then we have Rav Nachman Amar ben Tesha ben Eser mechanchina otan l'shaot ben Echad Esar mashlimin midirabanan. Ben Shtem Esrei mashlimin midioraita. So Rav Nachman already is different. Because if you remember, in our Gemara, so Rav Huna is basically the same, but there was a qualifier at the end that said this is talking about a tinoket. We started tinoket at 8 years and 9 years. And then we had Rav Nachman, he says, Bentesh, here he says, Bentesha ben Eser machanchinotan l'shaot ben achadesar mashlimin midirabanan. In the Girsa of our Gemara, what did it say? Of Nachman Amar ben Tesha ben Eser mechanchino tan l'shaot, that's the same. But then in our Gemara it said ben Achad Esrei ben Shtem Esrei mashlimim midirabanan, and ben Shlosh Esrei mashlimim midoraita b'tinok. And that's why we said that Rav Huna and Rav Nachman don't disagree, but one's talking about a girl and one's talking about a boy. But now when we look at the Rif, he has a different girsa altogether in Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, that ben Tesha ben Eser mechanchino tan l'shaot ben achadesar mashlimin midirabanan ben Shtem Esrei mashlimin midioraita. So he doesn't say what? He doesn't say ben Achad Esrei ben Shtem Esrei mashlimin midioraita midirabanan uben Shlosh Esrei mashlimin midioraita. So at this point, I have to understand that Rav Huna and Rav Nachman don't agree. Because Rav Huna says you start the chinuch l'shaot, and he doesn't say it's for a girl, so we're going to assume that he's talking about a boy. In other words, really, and this is something we said I think 2 weeks ago, the default really is going to be to talk about a boy, unless we go out of our way to talk about a girl. So now we have altogether a different way of looking at this, that Rav Huna is saying that for a boy who's 8 or 9, mechanchino tolashot, and what does it mean 8 or 9? So we'll see. We're not going to have time to go into this, but I'll just tell you that when he says 8 and he says 9, the assumption of the later Rishonim, like the Ramban, was he meant 8 full years, which would mean a boy who's 9. a boy who, so really when it says ben shmona ben tesha, it means a boy who's 8 full years or 9 full years. In other words, a boy who's 9 or 10, then mechanchino shaot, and then when he's 11 or 12, ben eser ben achadesrei, we're going to say means really 11 or 12, mashlimi midrabanan. Ben shteimesrei, if he's 12 full years, meaning he's 13 in a day, mashlimin midioraita. And Rav Nachman disagrees. He says, no, first of all, the chinuch starts when he's 9 full years, meaning when he's 10, or when he's 11, mechanchinotan l'sha'ot. But when he's ben achadesrei, mashlimim midurabanan. So in other words, when he's 11 full years, meaning when he's 12, he's mashlim. He has to finish the fast midurabanan, and then when he's 13, he's mashlim miduraita. So what's the difference between Rav Huna here and Rav Nachman here? What's their machloket?
Rav Nachman starts everything a year later.
Well, he starts the chinuch l'sha'ot a year later, but he agrees, right? Everybody agrees that that this boy who's finished 11 years, he has to be mashlim midrabanan. Rav Nachman ben Tesha ben Eser b'chanchina d'Sha'ot ben achadesar mashlimim midrabanan. And that's, what did Rav Huna say? He said ben Shmona ben Tesha b'chanchina d'Sha'ot ben Eser ben achadesar mashlimim midrabanan. But they both agree that you have to, but by the time the boy is 11 full years, by the time that he's 12, he has to be mashlim midirabanan. And then they also both agree that when he's 13, he has to be mashlim midiraita.
Sure.
And then, go ahead. Paul, did you want to say something?
I am very much disturbed. Tell you why. No.
Okay. Why?
On one hand, the Gemara is a dispute, yes, of different opinions, what we call the machloket. And you can discuss the machloket. But now the text is floating. So you are not even completely sure about the machloket. So I don't know what to do with this. You can discuss. This person has opinion A, and the other, this rabbi has opinion A, and the other rabbi has opinion B. But now you come and say, no. The difference is, I think the difference was this one, and the other one, because I have a different text, the difference is another one. So it becomes uncontrollable.
Well, it's not that it's uncontrollable, but it becomes more difficult. But this is
you just don't know, because a difference in girsa is not a difference in opinion.
No, but it will. I understand what you're saying. The question before us is, so how can we make a reliable judgment as to the halacha if we're not certain about the text? So, granted, but this is it's not the first time we've spoken about this. Excuse me. I'm going to say two things about this quickly. So one of them is, you can understand, to contrast the Gemara with Tanakh, you can understand at some very early time, Kitvei Kodesh were considered to be so important that methodologies were established to make sure that there would not be variance in text.
Yes,
right? And that's
you
what we
have a
call the
Masoretic text, which
right. So we have the Masoretic text, which is based on
That's the text. That's the text. Maybe
that's the text,
very
and
few things, very few places you have a.
right. So
Mhm.
even if you count Bonagid, depending on how you count, there may be a few hundred differences between, let's say, Ktav Yad Leningrad
Leningrad.
and the Aleppo Codex, right, the
Yeah.
Keter Arab Tova. But we're talking maybe a few hundred differences in literally probably over a million different considerations, because you have just in the Torah alone, you have over 300,000 letters, and then you have all the Nikud and all the Ta'amim, and then you have that throughout the whole Tanakh. So a few hundred differences is actually a very small percentage. When we come to Gemarot, as you know from looking at the Hachi Garcinan website,
Yeah.
we have lots of different Girsaot, and the Hachi Garcinan website which is a very good presentation. But we have, it's also it's not even complete in the sense that some of the Girsaot that we have in Gemara, we don't have from Kitvei Yad of Gemara. We have them from Poskim. Like now, I'm looking at this riff.
On
I'm looking at,
quotations, yeah.
so I see the riff. The riff is quoting the Gemara. He's not making up the Girsa. This was his Girsa. Now we do say, I told you, usually the riff has the Girsa of the Rabbeinu Hananel. It seems here that he did not have the same Girsa as the Rabbeinu Hananel. And the way he learns, first of all, I just want to point out, and we haven't gotten to his Rabbi Yochanan. Oh no, we did read his Rabbi Yochanan. One of the things that's more elegant, if I can use that word, about the Rif's Girsa is now Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, and Rabbi Yochanan are all talking about a Ben Zachar. So all the grammar makes sense. They're all talking about a boy. Just Rav Huna says you start chinuch for the boy when he's 8. Rav Nachman says you start when he's 9. And Rabbi Yochanan says you really start when he's 10. Rabbi Yochanan Amar ben Eser ben Achadesir mechanchin otan l'shaot. Ben Shteimisre mashlimim midioraita b'tinoket. The only one who uses in his girsa, we mentioned last week, Rabbi Yochanan seems to only be talking about a boy, and he doesn't differentiate. But here in this girsa, Rabbi Yochanan says specifically that mashlimim ben 12 mashlimim midiraita betinok, and ben 13 mashlimim midiraita betinok. So now, in a sense, now we have a three-way machloket but we do have we have what I pointed out is for both Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, their point of agreement is that the child has to start fasting and completing the fast when they're 12. If it's a boy, when they're 12. They both agree on that. Just Rav Huna says if he's healthy, he also has to complete the fast when he's 11. Rabbi Yochanan Bichlal doesn't hold that there's such a thing as fasting, of completing the fast before the age of bar bat mitzvah. And now he says, the Rif speaks himself. So until now, the Rif has been quoting the Gemara. And now he speaks. So Paul, you can read Afal Gav.
Another. Were these commentators aware that they had different versions of the text they are commentating?
They often did, but not always. And an example of that might be...
So how could they be sure? How could they say, my version is because this is the version I have some, I don't know, I bought or found, or I got it from my father. Why is it better than the one of the Rambam or something like this? It's very strange.
No, it's not so strange. So first of all, consider the reality. Nowadays, right, the reality that we live in,
No,
we get
everything is printed, yes.
right. It's not, and now we're beyond that because now I have all these things on the internet. I don't
Mhm.
even have to go now to a dozen different libraries around the world to look at different
Mhm.
girsot of the Gemara. I think
Mhm.
I pointed out to you that the first critical edition of the Gemara was done in the middle of the 19th century in a sefer called the Dikduke Sofrim. Did we
Mhm.
talk about this?
Mhm.
You've
Does this
mentioned it
sound?
before, yes.
You mentioned it, yes.
I have mentioned it, right? So
Mhm.
here, like, um, too bad I didn't put a bookmark in it, but he has quite a long discussion of our sugya here. This is Sefer Dikduke Sofrim, which was printed originally in a bunch of small volumes, and then some time ago, I have the whole Dikduke Sofrim. Somebody took the time to like basically cut and paste it and lay it out in two huge volumes. This is the first volume. It's one of my biggest books, but this is what it looks like. What he has on the one side, on the right side of the page, is he doesn't have the full text of the Gemara. What he did is he took the text from the Vilna edition, which was the most in his day was also the widely accepted version, and the lines that have differences in Ktav Yad Minchen, he found a Ktav Yad that was almost entirely complete on all of Shas, that was clearly different, and so he went and he noted all the differences between the Vilna edition and the Ktav Yad Minchen. But what he did, which is a phenomenal job at the bottom, which you can't really see, it's a little Rashi script. He went through other Girsaot that we know from other Rishonim and the way they quote the Gemara. And he has very detailed discussions about this. He was the first one to really, he's not the first one to recognize this problem because Rishonim already were aware of the problem that there are different Girsaot. But in a modern sense, he writes the first critical edition. But look,
So
just
it's
a
not only
second.
the manuscripts; it's also the way they are quoted in the various commentaries.
Essentially, by yeah, mainly by Rishonim,
Mhm.
mainly by Rishonim, because then one of the reasons for that is because by the time you get to what we call the age of the Achronim, you're already in the era of printing,
Mhm.
right? So then things start to become more standardized. They're not fully standardized because we also have different girsot from different uh, madurot, different editions of, let's say, Gemara, for example. And why do we have that? Because when the printers went to press, they were copying the kitvei yad that they had in their possession. And we know that not all the kitvei yad agreed.
Mhm.
So, just to get back to your question, so yes, uh, Rishonim, Gaonim, these people were aware of different Girsaot. It doesn't mean that they were aware of all the Girsaot, right? So, for example, we started off by looking at the Rambam, and when we saw the Hasagat Ravid, and the Ravid said, we don't have his Girsa. In other words, what do we see from the Ravid's comment? That he was aware that the Rambam had a different Girsa, but what he's saying essentially is, we don't have that Girsa. I'm not going to hold by his Girsa. And I'm going to paskin by the way the way our Girsa goes. So that was his thing. And in any event, wait a second. Let's go back to the Rif. Just a second. Do you see the riff on the screen?
I see, yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
מדאורייתא בתינוקת.
Okay, good. All right.
אף אגב.
Yes, okay. So now I'm just going to read a little bit myself. Af al Gav, so until now he's been quoting the Gemara. And now the Rif is going to comment himself. He's going to say, Af al Gav the Kayamalan Rabbi Yochanan, Damar Tinok bat 12 v'Tinok ben 13, Mashlimin midiraita. So even though Kayamalan, even though Mikuyam lana, we're going to hold halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan when he says that a girl who's 12 and a boy who's 13 have to finish the fast midioraita. He says, Kayamalan karavhuna v'Rav Nachman debatrai inon. We do hold nonetheless like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman because they are batrai, right? They're achronim in the Gemara. That what? What do we hold by like them for? Demashlimim midirabanan. So even though we hold like Rabbi Yochanan in terms of when a boy or a girl comes of age that they have to complete the fast midiraita, but we also hold like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman because they're batrai. And here this seems to be in the going, even though his girsa wasn't apparently the same as the Rabbeinu Hananel, but this was the svara of the Rabbeinu Hananel, right? He says we're going to hold like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman because they're batrai, and what are we going to hold like them by? Demashlimim midurabanan kedei lechanchan. That they have to finish the fast in order to educate them. Mi ben achadesrei. From the time that they've completed 11 years. Or from the time they're 11 years old. Bein letinoket. Whether it's a boy or whether it's a girl. Uben teshu, ben eser, mechanchinot an l'shaot, kiderav Nachman. Right? In other words, we're going to hold like Rav Nachman, that when they're 9 or 10, that we do chinuch l'shaot, shimayara gilechu b'shtei shaot, v'achinoto b'shalosh, b'shalosh v'achinoto ba'arba. So, the way the Rif, as it were, kind of finesses this question of who to paskin by, he says, look, we hold like Rabbi Yochanan in terms of their status midioraita, but midirabanan we're going to hold like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, and he says explicitly that that they have to finish the fast midirabanan from the time they're 11, whether it's a boy or a girl. In other words, we don't differentiate. And that's what I pointed out to you, that according to the Rif's Girsa, that's the point of agreement between Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. And so now when I go back and I look at the Rambam, which is here, so now I can understand the Rambam. What did the Rambam say? Ben 11 shana, ben zachar, ben nekeva, mitanel mashlim midivrei sofrim, kedei lechancho b'mitzvot. Now I understand where the Rambam got this psak, that a boy or a girl who's 11 years old have to finish the fast midivrei sofrim. He got it from the Rif. And like I told you, so the Rambam, in almost every case where the Rif had a psak, in nearly every instance, the Rambam simply agrees with the Rif. And I'm sure I've mentioned this to you more than once, that the Rambam calls the Rif that he essentially the greatest of all poskim. He held the Rif in the highest esteem. Okay. So that gives us a little bit of insight into what was going on. I didn't have time to show you this, but the Meiri on this sugya So the Meiri is from Lunil, as I recall. Uh, Michael Schwartz, a long time ago when we were learning Masechet Brachot, you may remember that we looked at the Meiri on Sugya. Who is the Meiri? Rabbi Menachem ben Shlomo Mishpachat Meiri, who was born in 1249 and passed away in 1315. Migdolei Chachmei Provence, Bismano. And he wrote a lot of books. So the Meiri, just so you know, the Meiri is in a way you, what we might think. It's almost like the way we think of Steinsaltz. It's similar. It's not line by line in the Gemara, but what the Meiri does in each sugya, he explains the sugya in his own words, and he brings the deot of various Rishonim that preceded him. So, so he lived in the 13th century, so he was well after the Rif and Rashi and the Rambam and many of the Balei Tosos and the Ramban and so forth, and the Ravid, and he quotes all of these people. He doesn't quote them by name. He has different kinuyim for each of them. But I'll just show you one thing that he says here. He starts off by quoting the Mishnah and giving his perush on the Mishnah. I'll just say, he says, Amar hami'iri hatinokot ein ma'ninotam b'yom kippurim u'machanchinotam lefi nei shana lifnei shtayim, etc. Mishnah zu v'sugya shala. So now he says, this Mishnah and the sugya, right, the discussion in the Gemara, upsaka yotzei mimena mivulbal biyad ha-mifarshim. It's very confused amongst the Mefarshim. Uma shenira lana lifsok binyan zeh derech klalhu sheshnei minei chinuchem. So then he goes and he goes on to discuss the sugya, and what he means by mivulbal is that he recognized that there were different girsaot, and the girsot varied widely. We only looked at a couple of girsot, really, outside of our Gemara. But there were other ones.
I appreciate the mevulbal. I thought this would be a modern word, but it's.
You see, it's an old word. It's a very old word, and you see, he's not afraid to use it. So this isn't he's not criticizing the poskim that came before him, but he's saying, when I'm now sitting and looking at the poskim that preceded me, I see it's very easy to get mixed up. And so what does he do? He tries to put it together in a cohesive way. And then, when you get to the tour is already much later. The tour is in the 14th century. So we'll look at this a little bit next time, but I'll just tell you, the Beit Yosef, right? Yosef Karo, in his commentary on the tour, he has a very long discussion here. And the reason he has to have such a long discussion is because he also recognized that there were many girsaot in this sugya, and he has to pay his respect to the various Rishonim that preceded him. And then we'll see ultimately how he paskened. But what's interesting, right, so this is not exceptional in the sense that we often, there are lots of different girsot through the Gemara, but we don't always have such widely varying girsot where the Piskei Dinim are going to be very different. They're going to be, widely different. So it makes it, it makes for an interesting discussion. I think we'll stop here. And so next week we'll pick up. I think what we'll do next week is we'll focus more just on halacha l'maaseh. We're going to look at the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll look at I think the Mishnah Brura and maybe the Aruch HaShulchan. V'zeh maspeak. But yeah, zelo pashut. This mamash lo pashut, and that's um, part of the challenge of learning Gemara is dealing with the fact that there are different girsaot, and then part of the challenge for a posek is to lisanen, right, to filter the different girsaot to figure out how will I paskin, what's going to ultimately be the psak. So yeah, the mamash davar lo pashut. But maybe the last thing I'll say about it is that look, I mentioned we have this idea of the Masoret for Tanakh, and we don't have really the same idea for the Gemara. Although I'm pretty sure I mentioned to you this was a concept that was raised by Rabbeinu Gershon back in the 12th century, maybe 11th century, 10th or 11th century, that he did want to make a Masoret for the Gemara because he already saw that there's a problem with Girsa. And I'm sure I mentioned this to you, that one of his Gzerot, or one of the Chramim of Rabbeinu Gershom, was that no one is allowed to change the Girsa in a Gemara. And if you want to change it, if you think there's a mistake, you have to write it as a note on the margin, but you're not allowed to change the body of the text. And as I explained to you, that's what Rashi did. Rashi incorporated the Girsa into his notes. But then within a generation, because Rashi was so popular, all the copyists, when they were copying Gemaras that came from Ashkenaz, they simply copied Rashi. They made Rashi's Girsa the body of the text, which is technically against what Rabbeinu Gershom wanted to do. So now we skip ahead, 800, 900 years, and in our day and age, what do? We have critical editions. So we don't say that we have one final Girsa of the Gemara, but at least now we can look at them and see them all at once. So make of that what you will. In any event, have a good night, everybody. Thank you, and Bezrat Hashem. See you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Laila tov.